It's the height of the Cold War, and the Soviet Union wages a brutal campaign in Afghanistan. Between 1980 and 1981, a newcomer from Saudi Arabia arrives to join the rebels trying to oust the Soviets, Osama Bin Laden. The Afghan resistance now receives support from the United States, Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and scores of Islamic volunteers. Bin Laden brings money and an expertise in construction, according to two men who worked alongside the future al-Qaeda leader.
He started building mountainside caves for storage of ammunition, and started building roads. And then he was very generous with money. He was popular among all Mujahideen.
When he was with us, helping the poor, widows, orphans, organizing funds for some needy peoples, we had no problem with him at all.
At the time, little about Bin Laden suggests the terrorist leader he will become. During the Afghan-Soviet War, the CIA was aware of him, but had no reason to view Bin Laden as a threat, says former spy Michael Scheuer.
The first time we heard about Osama bin Laden, he was involved first in refugee care in the camps in Pakistan, and then we heard that he moved into Afghanistan and began to have a unit of Arabs that he commanded. But he was on the side of the angels then. He was killing Russians, and so we didn't pay much attention to him.
Today, U.S. intelligence officers deny they had any direct contact with Bin Laden. They say that U.S. aid went only to the Afghans, not to foreign Islamic volunteers.
There are those in the media who just love to make the point that CIA trained the Afghan Arabs in Bin Laden.
It's a popular theory, but it's not one that has much traction.
People like bin Laden came with their own money, a built-in hatred for America, and access to weaponry either from their own sources or from the Pakistanis. They wanted nothing to do with us.
Pakistani journalist Rahimullah Yousafzai is one of the few reporters to interview Bin Laden more than once. He says that foreign Arab fighters like Bin Laden had little use for the CIA.
There was so much of Arab money coming here that they didn't need to get money from the CIA or ISI.
Charitable contributions from Saudi Arabia are rich enough to support not only the Mujahideen, but also the many Afghan civilians made refugees by the ongoing fighting. Over 4 million Afghans are forced to flee their homes for Pakistan.
1/3 of the population was made homeless for a very long period of time.
Here, along the border between Afghanistan and Pakistan, money from Saudi Arabia sets up hundreds of Islamic schools or madrasas to offer a free education for the Afghan refugee children. These madrasa students are known as talibs or Taliban. Their teachers are local mullahs like Muhammad Omar. Even today, Afghan children memorize and recite verses from the Quran. But during the desperate time of the Soviet War, many of these Islamic schools were used for a different purpose.
In certain areas, these madrasas were used to train the people and to send out the jihadis into Afghanistan.
Mullahs like Muhammad Omar send the Taliban to fight the Soviets with America's blessing, according to current Pakistani President Pervez Musharraf.
Taliban were the heroes in those days. People from madrasas were given military training, armed and sent across by us, by United States, by everyone.
Much of the information I'll be reading from today is from a book written by Anne Stenersen, who is a research fellow at the Norwegian Defense Research Establishment's Terrorism Research Group. Her book, Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Also, I'll be reading from primary source materials such as the Harmony documents, which are documents and files that were collected by the U.S. military when they assassinated bin Laden in a safe house in Pakistan, and also from news articles that were written during the Soviet-Afghan War. And in this discussion, we will be talking about the initial formation of Al-Qaeda. Al-Qaeda was formed in Peshawar, Pakistan in August of 1988, just as the Soviet military forces had started their withdrawal from Afghanistan. The goal of Al-Qaeda was simple. It was to be an organization for Afghan Arab veterans who would contribute to the struggle for the plight of Muslims elsewhere in the world after the Afghan war was over. But it is a misconception that Al-Qaeda gave up Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal, because Al-Qaeda's military engagement on the front line in Afghanistan increased from 1989 and continued when they left in 1992, and when Kabul, the capital of Afghanistan, finally fell to the Afghan Mujahideen. At the time of its foundation, Al-Qaeda was not an international terrorist organization, but it aspired to be a Muslim vanguard that would inspire and incite the Muslims to fight. And its method, at least initially, was to establish bases on Afghan territory to participate in guerrilla fighting against the communist forces in Afghanistan. The history of bin Laden's early activities in Afghanistan provides new insight into why Al-Qaeda was established and what it represented in Afghanistan at the time, and who had helped bin Laden and was the primary influence of having Arabs fighting in Afghanistan ranks was none other than Jalaluddin Haqqani, who commanded a Mujahideen army from 1980 to 1992 and is credited with the recruitment of people like Abdullah Yusuf Azam, bin Laden, and others, in which both of them began as volunteer fighters for the Haqqani network in the conflicts against the Soviets. And throughout this history, Al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Haqqani network have been intertwined throughout their history. And according to a declassified U.S. government report, a training facility belonging to Haqqani was located at Miriam Shah, in which fighters of Pakistan, Punjab, Arab, Kashmir, Uzbek, and Afghanistan, all connected with either Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, and were in resistance. Similar Al-Qaeda-associated training facilities connected to the Haqqanis by U.S. authorities have also been reported in northern Waziristan. And the Haqqani's network relationship with Al-Qaeda dates back right to the initial founding of Al-Qaeda. And while Al-Qaeda's stated goals are international in scope, the Haqqani has limited its operations to regional matters concerning Afghanistan and Pashtun tribalism. The organizations share an ideological foundation in which Jalaluddin Haqqani realized the importance of Abdullah Yusuf Azam's foundational Islamic legal decisions declaring the Afghan jihad a universally and individually binding duty of all Muslims worldwide. Though many Muslim leaders asked for aid from the oil-wealthy Arab states in 1978, after Afghan communists and Soviet forces conquered Kabul, it was Jalaluddin Haqqani, who was the only Afghan Islamic resistance leader to also request foreign Muslim fighters, and his was the only group to welcome Arab fighters from outside the region into its ranks, thus linking it to the broader jihad struggles and giving birth to what is known as global jihadism. Bin Laden would remark that in October of 1986, these were the happiest days of his life, when he started work on a remote construction site in the Jaji region of Khost, Afghanistan. The site had been discovered by Azamari, one of bin Laden's associates, on a reconnaissance trip he had taken with a group of Afghans the month before. The most amazing thing about the place was that it had a direct line of vision to the Soviet fort Ali Kel, situated next to the strategically important Karachar-Gardez highway. And no one was there, neither the Soviets nor the Afghan Mujahideen. The place would become known as Al-Masadah, also known as the Lion's Den, and would play a central part in Al-Qaeda's mythology. But at the time of its founding, there was little to suggest that this would be the birthplace of the world's most dangerous terrorist organization. Bin Laden's construction team consisted of 4 men and a bulldozer, a tent, and 3 reluctant Afghan guards. The original purpose of the project was to build a forward base for the Afghan Mujahideen, stationed at Jaji's base, some 5 hours' drive to the south. The Jaji base was controlled by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, an important Afghan leader, and was an important base for training, supply, staging of operations for Mujahideen in the area. For many of the Arab volunteers who had never seen combat, Jaji represented a front line of sorts, but it was more suitable for war tourism than real participation in fighting. The base had been expanded and fortified in 1985 and 1986 on the advice of Brigadier Yusuf, the Pakistan's ISI representative to the Afghan Mujahideen. The same order had gone to Jalaluddin Haqqani, who controlled a similar supply point to the southern part of Khost at Jarjawar. According to Brigadier Yusuf, up to 60% of the ISI supplies to the Afghan Mujahideen were passing through these 2 bases only. Needless to say, the protection of Jaji and Jawar was of high strategic importance. In 1986, bin Laden's construction company was involved with the work on the Jaji base. His team consisted of a handful of young Saudi men, some of whom were eager to participate in battles. According to bin Laden's own account, he allowed 2 of the men, Azamari and Shafiq, to go on missions with the Afghans, and this is how the site of Al-Masadah was discovered. In spite of its seemingly perfect location, it was not used by the Afghans because it was remote and had no road in the winter. Bin Laden wrote to Abdul Rasul Sayyaf and offered to build the road. And according to bin Laden, Sayyaf agreed because he saw the military value of the Masadah base. Others say he agreed only reluctantly. The Afghans had several reservations about the spot, but Sayyaf could not leave the Arabs alone, as they were guests and sponsors of the Afghan Mujahideen. They were also guests of the Haqqanis. He ended up supporting bin Laden with a guard force and later with weapons and fighters. The idea that Arabs should run the place does not appear to have been part of the initial agreement. Bin Laden was later quoted as saying in 1991, quote, "At that time, there was no such idea as building an independent base for Arabs. The idea was only to build a base for the Mujahideen. Although I was planning for myself that when we finished the camp and the caves and the trenches and the roads, and we did a good job, we would ask them for permission to use a cave that would hold 7 of our brothers. So the Mujahideen carried out an operation where there was a clash with the enemy. We would be allowed to be part of it," end quote. Other eyewitnesses from the time tell the same story. Bin Laden thought the Afghans would be in charge of the place while the Arabs would keep a small element that would go on to operations with the Afghans. This is essentially how bin Laden's men were already operating out of the Jaji base, and it is how Arabs were operating elsewhere in Afghanistan. But bin Laden had overestimated the Afghans, or lacked fundamental understanding of their combat culture. They were not interested in manning the al-Masadah position because it was too isolated and too exposed to the enemy. The Afghans were convinced the base could fall into enemy hands at any moment. So why spend resources on developing it? Problem was not the Afghans lacked fighting spirit, but that the whole concept of al-Masadah broke fundamentally with the principles of guerrilla warfare. The Afghans preferred to hit and run, not to defend strategic positions. Brigadier Yusuf met similar attitudes among the Afghans in 1985 when he ordered them to fortify the Jawawar and Jaji positions. The work went extremely slowly due to the Afghans' antipathy towards digging and reluctance to defend static positions, as he put it. But to break away from the book for a minute, there was also a cultural difference between the Arabs and the Afghans. Mostly foreign Arabs of this nature would be from a Salafi mind of view, a branch of the Sunni branch of Islam, whereas Afghans are noted for the Hanafi tradition, more in way of the Pashtunwali way of law, which predates Islam. Afghans were generational fighters. Arabs didn't know how to fight, and thus they didn't have time to train the Arabs on how to fight in guerrilla warfare. Bin Laden learned a bit about guerrilla warfare under the tutelage of Jalaluddin Haqqani. Haqqani himself was a notable warlord who had been given much funding and training from the Pakistan ISI. And later, when the CIA began their project called Operation Cyclone, they had to go through the Pakistan ISI, as the Afghans and the Arabs saw this as a war regarding just Muslims and not the NGOs, also known as non-governmental organizations. They were afraid that the United States would hijack the war for their own volition, seeing it as the West against the Soviet Union. This was a breach of Islamic law, as many would see it. And so bin Laden was getting the best of both. Fathers could accompany the Saudi bin Laden group, who were building roads and ditches, and also for his Arab Mujahideen. There would be training at the al-Masadah camp, which later would grow in number. But back to the book. Until late December 1986, the Arabs working on the base did not carry any guns. There are eyewitness statements saying that bin Laden relied on an Afghan guard team to protect the construction work on the base. The first time bin Laden ordered to buy weapons for the base was at the end of December 1986. They bought rifles, rocket-propelled grenades from a weapons market in Pakistan, and obtained heavy weapons, including a 75mm cannon and a Zipiya, the anti-aircraft gun, from Abdul Rasul Sayyad. The acquisition of heavy weapons indicates that bin Laden wanted the base to be permanently manned and defendable against Soviet tank and air attacks. It was an ambitious plan by a man with no military experience on his own. That is why, around January 1987, he asked Abu Obaida al-Banshiri, an experienced Egyptian fighter, to be the emir of the al-Masadah base. Al-Banshiri gathered a group of Egyptian associates that came along from release of the Egyptian jails, and he had fought with in Khost. Among them was Muhammad Atef, who was known then as Abu Hafs al-Masri, who would later rise to become military chief of Al-Qaeda at the time of the 9/11 attacks, to discuss the feasibility of bin Laden's plan. By now, it seems bin Laden had decided that Arabs would man the base permanently. The idea that Arabs were going to defend a static position inside Afghanistan against the Russians, a radical idea in the Arab environment in Peshawar. Bin Laden's initiative was met by a wave of criticism, not only by the Afghans, also from within his own organization. Services office was Mujahideen, known as the Maktab al-Khidmat, which was created from an idea of Abdullah Yusuf Azam and funded by Osama Bin Laden. Services office had been established by the Palestinian ideologue Abdullah Yusuf Azam in Peshawar in 1984 to assist and coordinate Arab volunteers aimed at regions for the Afghan Mujahideen. And many of Arabs came to fight against the Afghans, against the Soviets, because the Soviets during this time were being quite unrelenting in their bombardment of Afghan and Arab strategic positions, to which they had to train the Arabs in how to use Stinger missiles and rocket-propelled grenades. Many people had expired because of this, and the Soviets were winning the war. Hope to turn it around, and what was needed were the weapons provided under the CIA through the Pakistan ISI.
You see that we have been fighting for 7 months. You know that we will go to the jihad, but it is difficult for us to fight with sticks and be calm about it. But if we have guns, we will feel more confident and could easily attack. Even if you don't give us guns, we will go.
In Kuna, the fighting is organized by the Hizbi Islami led by engineer Hekmatyar. But in the country as a whole, there are 6 other parties, each claiming to control different areas. The differences among the parties are unresolved, and all attempts at forming an alliance have failed. Nevertheless, their common aim is to take Kabul and overthrow the Halk government.
They have now reached the surrounding areas of Kabul. Some of the areas are completely free from government control. You know that Afghanistan is a mountainous country. 85% of it is covered by mountains, and most of the mountains areas are liberated. Now the government only controls the main roads and large cities, and that only during the day. During the night, the Mujahideen take control.
During the day, women and children hide in shelters in the mountains, as the areas controlled by the Mujahideen are being bombed daily by government planes.
In the flat areas of Chigal and the areas around the provincial capital, they have used every kind of bomb with the exception of the atom bomb. In this way, they are attempting to bring the people under control. The main damage is to property, and they have destroyed houses.
To bin Laden, it was obvious. Now, from a military view, bin Laden was not a military man. He was a man of deep religious conviction. His ideal type of warfare would be modeled not on Sun Tzu, but on the Prophet Muhammad. When the Afghans failed to show up to protect the base, Bin Laden saw the problems as a lack of resolve and courage on the part of the Afghans, a problem that he felt he had a duty and the ability to rectify. Bin Laden wanted to inspire and incite the Afghans to fight in the same way that the Prophet Muhammad had done, by leading by example. When discussing the difficulties of defending al-Masadah, Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri recalled, quote, Bin Laden was not dissuaded by military arguments. He talked on the grounds that he wanted to gather the Arab brothers and to lift the moral spirit of the Afghans, and that we would at the very front of the fighting ranks against the enemy, end quote. In the larger context of the Afghan-Soviet War, al-Masadah played a modest role. Al-Masadah was one in a series of frontline positions during the mountains of Khost and Paktia in 1986-1987, overlooking the main cities of Khost and Gardez and the roads between them. The purpose of these positions was to carry out reconnaissance of the enemy and serve as vantage points for skirmishes, ambushes, and mortar attacks. Arabs would be fighting at this point. The idea of fighting in the presence of Afghans was so that the Arabs could prove that they could fight as well. Involved in combat activity between April and May of 1987. The harshest battle took place at the end of May 1987, which corresponded with the last days of Ramadan. The battle is not listed in any of the standard works on the Soviet military campaign in Afghanistan, although it is probably listed in lesser-known Russian sources, which have been not examined here. The Soviet attacks on al-Masadah have been thoroughly described by Arab eyewitnesses to the event. The larger campaign they were part of, which was the 3-week Battle of Jaji offensive, is referred in Arab and English press sources from the time. The American mercenary magazine Soldier of Fortune, which actually carried one of the few available military analyses of the Battle of Jaji, was found in the Western press and described the battle as the most important battle of 1987 and perhaps of the entire war. It is beyond the scope of this book to evaluate the truth in this statement. Be sure, the Battle of Jaji was certainly no game changer. The Soviets had already decidedly to withdraw from Afghanistan by the time the battle took place. The Ali Kel garrison, the Soviet fort that the battle was designed to relieve, was abandoned less than a year later as part of the Soviet withdrawal plan. From a military point of view, the most striking thing about the Battle of Jaji was the large number of Spetsnaz, which are Russian special forces, that were killed and wounded, and the number of aircraft downed. An article in the Washington Post suggested that 120 Spetsnaz were killed around Ali Kel in the end of May, and another 250 to 300 were killed or wounded in the first half of June. In the same period, some 15 enemy aircraft were shot down. This was popular news to the American administration at the time, which had recently started supplying the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles. Not know if Stingers were used in the Jaji battle. The Arabs at Al-Masadah certainly did not have any. If they had, they would probably have boasted about it in contemporary sources because the Stinger was a prestigious weapon to have. The Arabs did indeed claim to have it later in the Battle of Gardez in the summer of 1991. A fighter from Bin Laden's group said they had 2 Stinger missiles that they had bought from Gulbuddin Hekmatyar. But at Jaji, the Arabs said they shot at Soviet helicopters with machine guns and rocket-propelled grenade launchers. This was a feasible tactic at the time because the Soviet pilots were flying at low altitudes due to the fear of the Stinger missiles. The Arabs at Jaji claimed they single-handedly killed 25 Spetsnaz who attacked the base at the end of May 1987. The numbers are not possible to confirm, but the importance here is not so much the numbers. It is the massive propaganda effect that these stories came to have on the status of Bin Laden. The Arabs at Al-Masadah consolidated Bin Laden's status as a military leader of the Arabs and paved way for the establishment of Al-Qaeda as an organization independent from the Afghan Services Office. Now, to offer some thoughts. This was indeed why Bin Laden was a famous figure in Afghanistan from this point forward, because word spread fast between the Afghan ranks led by Abdul Rasul Sayyaf, Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, Ahmad Shah Massoud, and Jalaluddin Haqqani, in which some of these Afghan warlords who accepted Arabs in their ranks later on, which was initially the idea of Jalaluddin Haqqani, because they saw that the Arabs indeed were willing to fight and die for the noble cause relating to the Afghan Mujahideen. Bin Laden from this point forward was now respected, not in the same playing field as other long-standing but he did gain the respect of other Afghan warlords who were far more insular than the Arabs in general. And this led to a recruitment effect that would overflow not just the Maktab al-Khidmat, but also in the Haqqani ranks, as well as al-Masadah. And training these people were former Egyptian military soldiers, lieutenants, and police officers like Abu Ubaidah al-Banshiri, Abu Haraj al-Iraqi, and Abu Hafs al-Masri. These people were very much capable of training Arabs and Afghans in the arts of small arms fire, rocket-propelled grenade launchers, and Stinger missiles in close combat quarters, guerrilla warfare. And this idea of Al-Qaeda soon began to come. Al-Qaeda from the Arabic means the base meaning Al-Masadah, the training base for Arabs. To go back to the book now. The Arabs at Al-Masadah may have been heroic, but they put their Afghan hosts in a difficult situation. At the height of the Soviet attack in May 1987, Bin Laden ordered the Al-Masadah to be evacuated. However, a handful of Arabs refused to leave the base, even after most of the defensive weaponry had been removed. This is the group that, according to legend, killed 25 Spetsnaz with their own hands. In another version of the story, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf had to send a group of Afghan Mujahideen back to the al-Masadah camp because it would not look good if the Afghans abandoned their guests. But in any case, the result was the same. The story about the small group of Arabs at the al-Masadah who had withstood a massive Soviet attack morphed into heroic stories about self-sacrifice and divine intervention. From here, of Al-Qaeda was born. Battle of Jaji in May 1987, there is very sparse information of what happened at al-Masadah. Saudi journalist Basil Muhammad wrote that after the battle, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf ordered the Arabs to evacuate the base and to return control of al-Masadah to the Afghans. Bin Laden complied with the handover, but in the following months continued to send teams of Arab fighters into battles in the Jaji region. According to Basil, this was done neither with the permission of Sayyaf nor Abdullah Yusuf Azam. The event may be seen as an act of rebellion on the part of bin Laden, which should not be overinterpreted. As far as we know, Abdul Rasul Sayyaf never denied bin Laden's men access to al-Masadah. He simply argued that Afghans should be in charge of it. Bin Laden could probably continue battle with Afghan field commander in Jaji, so long as the commanders themselves agreed to this. This was the practice that had existed ever since the start of the Afghan-Soviet War. In April 1988, the Soviet forces abandoned the Ali Kil fort in Jaji as part of their withdrawal from Khost province. This means that al-Masadah lost its tactical importance, and at some point, it was likely abandoned as well. But for bin Laden and those around him, the military work in Afghanistan had just started. Chapter. But just to add more to it, bin Laden had received guerrilla training from the Haqqanis. The Haqqanis themselves were getting military weaponry aid from Pakistan ISI through the CIA's Operation Cyclone program. And to the misconception that bin Laden had been trained by the CIA directly, al-Masadah was receiving directly from the CIA, this is not backed by any sources whatsoever. Later on, there may have been a trickle-down effect that have affected bin Laden, as well as the Maktab al-Khidmat, in which they received funding from the ISI through the CIA and not even know where the money was coming from or the training initially. All they knew was that they were getting help from the Pakistan ISI, and that the Pakistanis were using the Arabs and the Afghan Mujahideen to fight off against the Soviets because they feared that the Soviets would invade Pakistan next. And so it was in their best interests to basically train and fund the Arab fundamentalists against their enemy, the Soviets. Bin Laden himself, the legend grew from this point forward. And later on, when he returned to Afghanistan in 1996, through acceptance of the Taliban, the nature of al-Qaeda, the base of al-Qaeda, was already beginning to grow. And the ideology behind bin Laden's and al-Qaeda in terms of a political enemy was not at all pointed toward the West or Israel, come a little bit later. But the ideas of expanding the jihad outside of Afghanistan didn't start with Bin Laden, but with the Egyptian takfiris like Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, and more importantly, Sayyid Imam al-Sharif, also known as Dr. Fadl, who wrote the doctrine that Al-Qaeda and Arab fundamentalist groups should band together in their cause to fight against any opposing kafir, non-believing entity to ensure the world as a caliphate for the Islamic Ummah, also known as the far enemy. But in order to do that, we need to conquer Arab government that would not implement Quran or the Sunnah as the basis of law. It would be called the near enemy. And so the Taliban, even though they had ideological differences with Al-Qaeda, were now stuck with Bin Laden from this point forward.
Bin Laden existed in Afghanistan exactly 17 years before our government existed. We inherited him. And the fact is that such people were instigated by the CIA and by the government of America in that time to go and fight the Soviets. And such people were called the heroes of independence. And all of a sudden, they have changed now to terrorists. We don't say that we are defending terrorism, but we need to know whether they are really terrorists or not. We were called the puppets of America until 1998. So we don't know as to what to do now. We have been given no counter proposals. And now the perception in Afghanistan is that maybe the United States is always looking for a boogeyman, because so many people have their jobs following Bin Laden now. If Bin Laden is not there, they will lose jobs.